Okay, so let's get back to where we were last time. Last time we said that we could value constant dividend growth stocks as a growing perpetuity. And we talked about everything that's up here. Now, here's the fun thing. We can, through the magic of algebra, rearrange that formula to come up with something called the dividend growth model, which actually puts stock returns in terms of dividend growth. So when we rearrange this, we have R is equal to D1 divided by P0 plus G. Now when we were in chapter 10, we talked about dividend yield. And we said the dividend yield would be D1 over P0. Do you see that in this formula anywhere? Yeah. And so we said then that returns were equal to dividend yield plus what? Capital gain yield. Now, capital gain yield has to then be the same as G. Because remember, that's what we said, it's dividend yield plus capital gains yield. We've already got the dividend yield nailed down here. The rest of return has purely to do with the growth of the dividends. Now keep in mind, this formula only works for stocks with constantly growing dividends. But this is pretty cool. It's a pretty cool outcome. And we can actually then say that the stock price, because the capital gains return is the rate at which the stock price grows. And so the stunning conclusion we reach here is that dividends and the stock price grow at the same rate for constantly growing dividend firms. Let me say that again. The stock price and the dividend grows at the same rate if we have constantly growing dividends. Now, I want to walk through some things here that will make your life easier on the exam. We've already talked about how D1 is equal to D0 times 1 plus G. And I could also say D2 is equal to D1 times 1 plus G, because we're always just growing by multiplying by 1 plus G to get to the next dividend. Well, if I use the substitution principle, because this thing is equal to this thing, all I have to do is drop that in there, and I end up with D2 is equal to D0 times 1 plus G times 1 plus G. And if I do a little bit of math magic here, then I end up with 1 plus G squared, because that's just something times itself is the square, right? Okay, now this is pretty interesting, because it turns out that I can say that D2 is equal to D0 times 1 plus G to the 2. I could actually generalize that and say that dy is equal to dx times 1 plus G to the y minus x. So that's all I've got to do to find. So I can tell you, give me D729 given D679. All you have to do is take that times, so 1 plus G to the 729 minus 679 power, which is 50. All it would be is to the 50th power. Now, I tell you this because a lot of times, maybe I'll ask you for the dividend in year 7. Do you really want to figure out D1 and then figure out D2 and then figure out D3? No, you're gonna massacre yourself on an exam doing that. So what you would do is say that D7 is equal to D0 times 1 plus G to the 7 minus 0, or the 7th power. What if I gave you D1 instead? It would be D7 is equal to D1 times 1 plus G to the what power?
7 minus 1.
Yeah, so 7 minus 1 would be 6, right? To the 6th power. Does that make sense? Okay. It doesn't actually have to make sense. Just put that on your note sheet and know how to use it, right? Okay, now remember, I just told you that the stock price grows at the same rate as the dividend for firms with constantly growing dividends. And so we can actually do the same thing with price. We could say that P sub y is equal to P sub x times 1 plus G to the y minus x. So when I ask you the price 30 years from now for a stock with constant growing dividends, instead of having to run through this thing over and over and over again, you just say P30 is equal to P0 times 1 plus G to the 30th power. That's going to make your life a whole lot easier. And here's why. And I actually ran into this down in Mississippi. I had students, and some had listened and paid attention, and I could see when I gave this question on the exam, the ones who paid attention got it in like 30 seconds. And I actually put it at the beginning of the exam, and that was kind of cruel, because the ones who didn't know sat there, kept cranking. Like, you're never going to get there. It's just not going to happen within the constraints of the time on the exam. So, having this and this on your note sheet will be a real lifesaver for at least one question. Let me say that one more time. Having this and this on your note sheet will be a real lifesaver for at least one question. Okay, any questions before we move on? Okay, so far everything's been fairly clear-cut, and we've had a formula, and I love formulas because you can use algebra, but now we are to something called differential or supernormal dividend growth. And that is where the dividends grow faster at first and then they slow down later. And we talked about the life cycle of a company last time. When they first start paying dividends, they're going to start out small, but they're going to grow faster. Then later on, they're going to slow the growth of their dividends, is the typical pattern. Okay, now we did say for the constantly growing dividends, you can't have R or G greater than R. But for supernormal, for short periods of time, we can, for short periods of time. It just, the formula blows up. Now, for the last part, where we let it grow constantly for all time, that part, R must be greater than G. So we've already mentioned there's no slick algebraic method for solving this, so instead of a formula, we're going to have a process. We're going to have a process, and by the way, it probably would do you well to have this on your note sheet. It probably would be good for you to have this process on your note sheet. Number one says, find the individual dividend amounts up to the start of constant growth. So during that first fast part, we're going to find all those individual dividends. And then we are going to find the price of the stock at the start of constant growth. And to do that, we're just going to use that formula that we used to with the constant growing dividends. We're going to assume that after that constant growth starts, that goes on forever, and therefore we can use that growing perpetuity type formula. And the third step, because remember, the price or value of anything is the present value of the expected future cash flows, then we are just going to find the present value of those dividends and that stock price. Because after all, the stock price at the start of constant growing dividends actually represents the present value of all those dividends going forward. So this comes right back to our definition of what is the value of a stock. It's the present value of the expected future dividends discounted at a rate appropriate to the risk. So right now, that's all just flying straight over your head, so it's best to do this with an example. And our company is going to pay a dividend of $1.15 1 year from today. Is that D0 or D1? D1. D1 is pretty easy in this case because they say 1 year from today. What if I said the next dividend will be? Would that be D1 or D0? D1. What if I said it just paid a dividend of $1.15? What would that be?
D0.
D0. What if I said the last dividend was? D0, right? So if it has the smell of present or past to it, it's D0. If it has the smell of future, not more than 1 year, then it's D1. Okay, so then over the next 4 years, that dividend is going to grow at 15% per year, and after that, the growth will settle down to 10% per year. And the question is, what's the value of 1 share of the company stock today if the required rate of return is 15%? The dividend we are given is on a per share basis. And so when I find the present value of all those future dividends, that's going to give me the value of the firm on a per share basis. Okay, now what do? Well, start by drawing a picture. This is the biggest mistake students make, is they think they can do this without drawing a picture. So don't be that person. So here we go. The first thing I'm going to do is draw that dividend at time 1. And I'm going to label it $1.15. And then I'm going to figure out how far out constant growth begins. And how I'm going to do that is through something very sophisticated. I call it the kindergarten method. Follow along with me here. You put your finger at the beginning, and they say it grows for the next 4 years. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that brings us out to time 5. It brings us out to time 5. Now, what if instead they had given us D0? They didn't give us D1, they gave us D0. And then we go out 4 years. Where would we be? Yeah, time 4. So that's why the kindergarten method will save you a world of hurt. If you can correctly identify whether it's D1 or D0, you really don't have to remember. You just use your finger. Okay, now, that first growth rate is 15%. The second growth rate is 10%. And we see that that constant growth begins at time 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to figure out, we already know D1, but we need to know D2, D3, D4, and D5. So that's step 1. Figure out the dividends up to the start of constant growth. Then step 2, we're going to find a price at time 5 that represents all those dividends going forward. And we can use that constant dividend growth model to do that, or the constantly growing dividends. And then we're going to find the present value of all those things. And so I'm going to show you, and by the way, I've been working on this for like almost 2 decades now. And I have worked on this method and got it down to where if you pay attention, you should be able to get the right answer. I mean, it's as simple as it can get. And it uses your calculator. So go ahead and get your calculator out. And we're going to start with our cash flow. CF, second, clear work. Why do I have to clear the work out? If you put something in there that went beyond 5 years previously, it will hang out there and cause you trouble. Okay, CF0. Is there any cash flow that happens at time 0? No. And I will tell you this, even if they give you D0, do not include it. Let me say that again. Even if they give you D0, do not include it. We always assume that D0 goes to the person that we buy the stock from, and we're going to buy it immediately thereafter. Now let's say we're planning to sell this stock at time 5, we will collect D5. So that it's consistent on both ends. The only time you should ever include D0 is if the problem specifically says that you received D0. I will not do that to you. I will not do that to you. Okay. So what do I do from here? What do you think D1's going to go in? Mr. Mers. Yeah, so we're going to arrow down, and we're going to put 1.15, and we're going to hit enter. Got to hit enter, or it's like it never even happened. Now we're going to do something a little extra here. We're going to say store 1. You'll see why here in a second. Okay, now I'm going to arrow down. What do you think F01 is going to be? Yeah, it's just going to be 1. Because these things are constantly they're growing, no two are going to be identical. So we're going to arrow down. C02, here's what I want you to do. We're going to recall 1, which is dividend 1, and we're going to multiply by 1 plus the first growth rate. What is the first growth rate? 15%. So we're going to multiply by 1.15 equals, enter. And then, what do you think we're going to do? Store it. Yeah, very good. Store 2. Now we're going to arrow down. We know that F02 is 1. Now we're down to C03. Ms. Minahan, what should I do here?
Recall 2, sorry, I was a little bit ahead, so I said.
Yeah, she got it. Hey.
Recall 2, and then times 1.15.
Very good. Equal. Enter. And then what?
You're going to store it in 30.
Yeah. Ms. Minahan's jumping ahead.
Sorry.
That's okay. Arrow down, arrow down. Let's see. Mr. Pelosi, what do you think we should do here?
Recall
Uh-huh.
3
Uh-huh.
times 1.15.
Yep. Equal. Now what do?
Enter.
Enter.
Store 4.
Very good. Thank you. Okay. Arrow down, arrow down. Mr. Ali, what should we do next? You don't know. You got to play along at home to win, Mr. Ali.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
Miss.
watched the video.
He's gonna watch the video later. Are you just not awake in the morning?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so Ms. Dowden, can you tell me what to do next?
Recall 4
Very good.
times
Uh-huh.
1.15
Very good.
equals, and then
Enter.
enter, and then store 5.
Yep. Okay, so now we have all the dividends up to time 5, and we have one thing that will left that we have to calculate before we can find present value. Yes?
Wait, so we press enter twice after we press store, we have to press enter again?
No, I'm just paranoid. You could test it for yourself. You don't have to. But the trick is when I hit store 5, look what happens. The equal sign goes away. And then of course I'm freaking out, right? Yeah, so I have OCD. You don't need to do that. Okay, so now we have D1 through D5. And now we need to find the price at time 5. And we need to use, so typically, we would say D6 over R minus G. Because once again, it's just like P0 is equal to D1 over R minus G. X. Right? So it's just one less, right? That's typically how it works. How can, we don't have D6, but what do we have? D5. And so I can substitute in here D5 times 1 plus G divided by R minus G. I've got that, I've got that, I've got this. Now, here's the fun thing. You got to keep in mind that this is the second growth rate. It's got to be the second growth rate. Because after all, the growth, starting at constant growth, is not that first growth rate, it's the second one. And so the price of that represents all those dividends going forward is going to be calculated using the second growth rate. I've got D5 in my calculator right now. So all I have to do is multiply by 1 plus the new growth rate. What's the new growth rate? Yeah, 10%. So I'm going to go multiply by 1.10 equals, and that actually gives me D6. So then I could say divide by, open parenthesis, the required return, we haven't been told this, but it's 15% minus 0.1, close parentheses, equals. And so my P5 is $44.25. So far what we've got here is that C01 is equal to D1, C02 is equal to D2, C03 is equal to D3, C04 is equal to D4, but C05 is different. We actually receive 2 cash flows at time 5. What are they? D5 and price 5. Now what I have in this calculator right now is only P5. Most common mistake students make is that they will hit enter right now, and they will forget to put D5 in there. You got to be careful about that. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to hit plus recall 5 equals, and then we're going to hit enter. Got to do that because we're getting both the D5 and P5 at the same time. Question so far? Okay. Now, how am I going to, what button should I hit next in order to be able to find the present value of all that stuff? NPV, very good. And what should I put in for I, Ms. Roll? Give you a hint.
Would it be 10%?
Use it right here.
15?
I think it's 15.
Yeah, 15, sorry.
That's okay. Arrow down, compute. That tells us that the share price is $27 per share. $27 per share is the present value of all the future dividends. And you say, wait a minute, we did dividends and we did the price. But what did that price represent? The price at time 5 represents the dividends from time 6 till the end of time. And so we have actually done exactly what we said we were going to do and found the present value of all the expected future dividends. Would you like to see that again?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, so we're going to say CF second. Clear work. And I'm going to arrow down. What am I going to put in for C01? Nothing. No, that's what we put in for
Oh,
CF0.
1.15?
Yeah, 1.15. It's $1.15, right? They tell us that. We're just given that. I'm going to hit enter, and what else am I going to do? Mr. Ali, what should I do here? I'll give you a hint. It starts with store.
Store 1.
Very good. Store 1. Arrow down. What do I do here? Arrow down. Very good. Now, what do I do here? C02.
Recall
Yeah, recall 1. And what do I multiply it by?
1.15.
Yeah, 1.15. Now, it's 1.15 because it's 1 plus the first growth rate equals. Now, what should I do, Mr. Rosen?
Recall 1.
Oh,
Recall 2.
oh,
Store.
store.
Sorry.
Store. Now, Mr. Rosen, what should I store?
2.
Very good. Oh, look at this. I'm going to hit enter again just because I'm paranoid. There we go. And we know that we leave the F's all as 1, right? Arrow down. What do I do here, Mr. Murders?
Recall 2 times 1.15.
Times 1.15 equal enter. And then let's see here. Someone I haven't picked on. Mr. Breyer.
Store 3.
Store 3. Very good. Okay, arrow down, arrow down. Mr. Dawson, what do I do?
Store 3.
So recall 3
3
times 1.15. What do I do? I'm going to ask Mr. Dawson, what do I do here?
Very store.
Yeah, store 4. Enter. Arrow down. Arrow down. Now, what do I do? Ms. Dowden?
Recall 4
Yep.
times 1.15,
Yep.
and then equals
Uh-huh. And then what?
store
Uh-huh.
5.
Very good. Okay. Now, are we ready to do NPV? No, why not? Yeah, we need to have price 5. And so we're going to use the D5 that we currently have multiplied by 1 plus the second growth rate divided by R minus the second growth rate. We've been told R is 0.15. Let's see here. I'm going to multiply by what? Yeah, 1.10. And then divide by, open parenthesis, 0.15 minus 0.10, close, equals, what does that number represent? Price at time 5, right? But what do we have to do?
Add.
Yeah, plus, recall 5 equal, I've got to hit enter here. If I don't hit enter, I'm going to be in a world of hurt. Mr. Rosen, maybe that's the other reason that I did it, is because sometimes you actually have to, yeah. Okay, so now I've got all those cash flows in there. What button should I hit next? Yeah, I'm going to hit NPV. And Ms. Roll, what do I put in for I?
15%.
Very good. Enter. Arrow down. Compute. 27. That's how we do it. Now, I guarantee you that you will not be able to just do that without trying it again yourself a couple of more times. And the reason I can guarantee you that is probably the first 5 times I gave this lecture, I got it wrong. All 5 times, the first 5 times I taught this. And so if I'm having that kind of trouble, I know you're going to, or at least I strongly suspect. Okay, yeah.
Can you explain why you have to add the P5?
Yeah, okay, so remember that what we're really trying to find here is the present value of all the dividends going out till the end of time. And we would just use that formula that looks like this right here, except for one thing. This thing has a shift, right? And so basically what we're going to have to do is find the individuals up to that time. But then, to find out what's the present value of all those dividends that go out beyond that, we have a much simpler way. And that is just to say that the price at time 5 is equal to this. And so this gives us the present value from D6 all the way out to D infinity, only it's at time 5. And so that means that if I collect D5, I can sell the stock at that time for P5, right? So this would be your big cash flow out here at the end. I have to put that in, or I'm not accounting for all of the dividends that go out beyond year 5 to the end of time. Does that make sense? Yes.
Is P sub 0 the same thing as net present value?
Oh, yes. When we hit the NPV button, all NPV means is the sum of the present values of all the cash flows going forward. And we said that the price of the share of stock is the sum of all the present values of all the dividends going out till the end of time. And so it's the definitions are equal. Right? Good question. Other questions? Okay. Now, let's talk about estimating G. G is really, companies aren't actually going to give us this. They're not going to say, we're growing our dividend at 7.2% per year. So what do? Well, first of all, you could look at the historical average dividend growth rate. So let's say that I have 3 dividends. D0 is $1, D1 is $1.10, and D2 is $1. Let's see, what it would be, 21. So it'd be 1.21. So basically, we'd be looking at 10% growth there. All I did was figured out the growth. By the way, all you do is take, say, D1 minus D0 divided by D0, gives you the growth rate. And we can do the same thing for every year. D2 minus D1 divided by D1 would give us the growth rate for that period. And we just keep doing that for all the historical data that we have available. And then we find the average, just your plain old arithmetic mean. Okay, that's my favorite way. Unfortunately, that's not always information that we have. So we could also come up with it a different way. retention ratio is the addition to retained earnings divided by the dividends. When we retain that money, where does it go on the balance sheet? When we have addition to retained earnings shows up on the income statement, where does it show up on the balance sheet? Yeah, accumulated retained earnings. And in what section is that accumulated retained earnings? It's in equity. And so what we're trying to do here is look at what are we retaining. And then we're going to look at the return on those retained earnings. The return on the retained earnings is the same as the return on the equity, which is basically just ROE. And so we can actually estimate this growth rate simply by taking the retention ratio, multiplying it by ROE. Should you have this on your note sheet? Yes. Now let's think about ways that I could make this hard for you. What if instead of giving you the retention ratio, what if I give you the dividend payout ratio? What should you do?
Subtract from 1.
Yeah, 1 minus the dividend payout ratio gives us the retention ratio. And maybe instead of giving you ROE, I give you profit margin, total asset turnover, and equity multiplier. And you just use those things to find ROE. Or maybe I'm even meaner than that. And instead of giving you equity multiplier, I give you debt to equity ratio. What would you do?
Add 1.
Yeah, you just add 1, right? So there are many ways that this could be made difficult, but you just go through the steps to get it boiled down to B times ROE. Okay, so those are our 2 ways that we can estimate G. Now let's talk about why that estimate of G is it's kind of scary. And the trick is looking at required return, we said, is the dividend yield plus that growth rate. And so if our estimate of G is 1% too high, what's that going to do to our estimate of the required return? If G is 1% too high, then R is going to be 1% too high. And if G is 1% too low, R is going to be 1% too low. Now, why does that matter? Well, let's assume for a minute that we've got a company that is entirely equity and that we are doing our net present value for a project. And the rule of thumb is, by the way, net present value is just the sum of all the present values of the expected future cash flows, right? That's all it is. It's just like we got through doing here earlier with the cash flows. If I'm looking at that formula, and in fact, let's just break it down using this formula, PV, for each one of those, I'm going to be finding the present value. So for every cash flow, I'm going to be looking at that cash flow, finding the present value, using 1 plus R to the T. Now, if my estimate of G is 1% too high, then my estimate of R will be 1% too high. I'm going to be dividing by a larger number, so my estimate of the present value will actually be smaller. My estimate of the present value is actually going to be smaller. Let's think about it the other way. What if my estimate of G is 1% too small? Then my estimate of R is going to be 1% too small. I'm dividing by a smaller number, and so the present value is actually higher. Now let's talk about what's more dangerous. If I overestimate G, then I've overestimated R and I've underestimated the present value of the future cash flows. So when I add all those things together and I subtract out my initial investment, if it's still positive, then I'm perfectly fine. The problem comes if we overestimate G, therefore overestimate R. We are underestimating the present value of those future cash flows. We may end up with a negative calculated net present value, which would lead me to reject the investment. So in that case, if I overestimate G, I may reject good investments. If I overestimate G, I may reject good investments. If I overestimate G, I may reject good investments. Now let's talk about the other way. What if I underestimate G? Then I've underestimated R and I've overestimated. Is that you, Ms. Rafael? I am sure it's a public health emergency. Oh, okay. Thank you. She works for the health department. That's why it's good to have her around. She can always tell us if we're getting a new epidemic. Okay, back to this story. If I have underestimated G, then I underestimate R. Now I've overestimated the present values, and now there is a chance that after I've subtracted out the initial investment, I would have a positive NPV because of those inflated present values, even if it's a bad project. So, estimating G too low increases the chances of accepting a bad project. Underestimating G increases the probability of accepting a bad project. Now let's take this down to the career level for you guys. What's more dangerous to your career? Accepting a bad project or rejecting a good one? Accepting a bad one because there's evidence, right? I have a buddy who we were working at a company, and he did the math on this plant, and it turned out it was a bad decision. And every time I drove by that plant, I thought, "Whoop, there's Joe's mistake," right? It was right there at Steele's Corner Road in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. You could drive by it and see it and know, right? Now, what if Joe had made the mistake in the other direction? Would we have ever known? No. Now, some of you are saying, wait a minute, I know how to do this. I'm just going to reject every single project, and that way I'll never accept a bad one. Why is that not a good plan? I'm hiring you to maximize shareholder wealth, right? How do we do that? By finding and implementing positive NPV projects. If you're not doing that, I'm going to come up with my own positive NPV project. I'm going to fire your ass and save myself whatever your salary is going forward, right? Does that make sense? So, don't think you just reject everything, but I would, if you're on the edge about something, reject it. Does that make sense? And there's a lot of trusting your gut on this stuff, because after all these numbers are just swags. They're just scientific wild-ass guess. And so when you get to the point that it's really kind of borderline, walk away. Does that make sense? Okay. Now let's talk about growth opportunities and stock value. If you've got a firm with positive earnings and no growth opportunities, we call it a cash cow. And here's why. Because if there are no growth opportunities, how much of the earnings should we be retaining? Zero, exactly. And so we're basically going to be paying out all of our earnings as dividends. Well, if there's no growth whatsoever, those dividends aren't going to be growing any. And so basically, we just have a firm that just keeps spitting off the same amount of dividends every year. Does that make sense? And so we are going to call that a cash cow. And we know the value of that cash cow is going to be D over R, because it's a zero growth dividend situation. But we also know that they're going to pay out all of their earnings per share as dividends. And so we can also say that the price at time zero of a cash cow is earnings per share divided by R. Okay, that's the first part. Now let's talk about what happens if the firm has growth opportunities. The value that they add is going to be measured by their net present value. And so if I'm out there looking at $1 million positive NPV project, and I've got 1 million shares outstanding, I'm going to take that $1 million in positive NPV, divide by the million shares, and that's going to be worth $1 a share to me. So that's going to be this NPV go. It's that NPV divided by the number of shares outstanding. And I can just add all the NPVs of all my projects that I'm working on together. And so basically we could say, well, the value of a firm that has these growth opportunities is the cash cow value plus this net present value of growth opportunities. So that's how we can value a firm that has growth opportunities. Now let's talk about why we're doing this. I'm doing this to tell you about the PE ratio so we can break it down to see what the PE ratio is really all about. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that NPV go model that we just came up with and I'm going to divide every single thing there by EPS. And so it's going to give me on the left-hand side P0 divided by EPS, which by the way is PE ratio. And if I take EPS, divide by R, and divide by EPS, I get left with 1 over R. And then, at the end, I'm going to have NPV go divided by EPS. And so now we can think about how these different things are impacting present PE ratio and what's driving this up and down. So R, if R is greater, all else equal, what is happening to PE ratio? Yeah, PE ratio, if R is greater, PE ratio goes down. R represents return, and we said that return and risk must go together. And so all things equal, all other things equal, if the risk is greater, the PE ratio will be lower. All other things equal, if the risk is greater, the PE ratio is going to be lower. Okay, now let's talk about the second part. The second part talks about how big our growth opportunities are compared to our current business. Remember that EPS is our current amount of earnings that we're getting, and the NPV go is the net present value per share of our positive NPV projects. And so basically that second thing represents growth. The greater our NPV go compared to our current businesses, in other words, the greater our growth opportunities, then the higher the PE ratio is going to be. So the greater the growth, the higher the PE ratio is going to be. The greater the growth, the higher the PE ratio is going to be. So let's take a look at some PE ratios. ExxonMobil, any idea what they do?
Gas.
Yeah, oil and gas, right? They've got a PE of 12.6, and in fact, they are among the lower ones up there. Do you think that it is low because it's high risk or low growth? So it's basically lower growth, right? So you guys are thinking about oil spills and things like that. Yeah, so it's really, I think oil and gas, pretty boring business. But why are the growth opportunities not what they used to be? Yeah, so we're looking at, and of course, keep in mind, I'm going to tell you right now, I remember back in the 70s when they told us we were running out of oil, and by like 1980, there would be no oil left. Was there oil when you guys were born? Yeah. So we keep getting told this, but let's just assume that that's the case, that we're running out of oil. The opportunity to grow that business is more limited. The other reason I would say that it's more limited to grow that business, because that business is already pretty big, right? So it's the newer firms in the newer areas that we would expect to see higher growth and therefore higher PE ratios. Ameren is an electric utility company. They're pretty boring too. They tend to be basically collecting utility bills that grow at about the rate of inflation. And so their dividends grow at about the rate of inflation. Their stock price grows at about the rate of inflation. And so their PE ratios are relatively low too. And let's skip over Newmont Mining. Let's talk about Starbucks. Starbucks. Do you think Starbucks is getting their high PE ratio because they are incredibly safe or because they're growing so fast? Yeah, it's the growth, right? So let me give you an example of the growth. 2006, my wife and I take a job in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and on the way in from our house, we pass a Starbucks. My wife says, oh, hey, there's a Starbucks. The next day we go in and we pass 2 Starbucks. Just another one had sprouted up. It's just so fast, like a weed. Now we're like, wow, Starbucks is growing pretty fast. Scoot forward 2 years, financial crisis. Does anyone have $4 for a cup of Starbucks? No, so people pronounce Starbucks as dead. What does Starbucks do though? They say, well, no, the growth's not over because now we're going to expand into China. And the critics, including me, said, that's not going to work. China's a tea culture. They don't drink that much coffee. And then I go over there in 2011 to teach my first class in China, and it's dark when we come into town. And the next morning I go out and I'm standing in front of the hotel and I stretch and I look up and right across the street is a Starbucks. I'm like, And I look and there's a line. And I thought, And then I go to teach my class, which starts at 8 a.m. And in China, the students bring their breakfast with them to class. The whole room stinks. They don't eat cereal. They eat like regular, like lunch and dinner food for breakfast. So the whole place stinks. But these young ladies are sitting on the front row, and they all have Starbucks cups. And I say, that's interesting. Did you actually buy Starbucks this morning, or did you put something else in a Starbucks cup that you had previously? Because people do this, to show off. They've been to Starbucks. And they said, no, we all went this morning. And my next question was, are you drinking tea or are you drinking coffee? And they said, coffee. Starbucks did what the analyst said was impossible, and that is to get Chinese people to drink coffee. And every time after that, when I would go back to China, I would see more and more Starbucks. I think I've been to China 5 times. Every time there was more Starbucks. So then people start saying, well, they can't grow forever in China. That's true. And Starbucks said, we're going to expand into India next. And then people complained. They said, well, India is only half coffee culture. In the south, they drink coffee. In the north, they drink tea. And I said, don't bet against Starbucks. After all, they got Chinese people to drink tea. Has anybody been to India lately? Have you been to India lately? Okay, so if you do happen to visit India, drop me an email and let me know if you saw a Starbucks while you were there. So Starbucks, it's got to be the growth. Now, let's start talking about comparing some competitors that are in the same business. We've got Walmart and Costco. Walmart is everywhere in the United States. And in fact, when I went to China, there were 3 Walmarts in the town where I was working. And so Walmart is basically everywhere. In fact, Walmart has started to kind of shut down businesses. They sold out in Germany, they sold out in South Korea, they've shut down some of their Chinese stores. And so the growth for Walmart doesn't look as good as it once did. But where's Costco? Where's Costco currently located? We've got one here, but if you look at the map, you've got the West Coast, it's got all these dots for Costco's. You've got the East Coast, it's got all these dots for Costco's. And then you've just got a tiny constellation of dots in the middle of the country. We are extraordinarily fortunate to have a Costco here in Springfield. It just really doesn't even make sense when you look at the map that they would choose to put one here. Now, what does that mean about Costco's ability to grow? That's high, right? They've got all that middle territory that they've yet to conquer. Compare that to Walmart. Walmart's conquered everything, and in fact is having to pull back in a few places. And so the growth at Costco is going to be much greater than it is at Walmart. The other thing I would say about Costco is that they just execute really well. They just do a great job. Walmart sometimes has problems. Now let's look at Apple and Lenovo. Lenovo, you may know better as Motorola. You know the Motorola, the phones that they make. Okay, both Apple and Lenovo make computers. They both make phones. And let's talk about why then Apple would have a lower PE ratio than Lenovo. Would you say that Apple products are priced for rich people or poor people? They're priced to the rich, right? And would you say that in this world we have more rich people or more poor people? Yeah, we've got more poor people. And anything the poor can afford, the rich can also afford. And so if you want to have a higher potential market for your phone, the lower price is the way to get that greater market. Lenovo sells similar quality stuff. It doesn't have the cachet of Apple, but it's similar quality stuff, but they sell it at a much lower price. Apple's already sold an iPhone to everyone who can afford one. And so now they're just waiting for us to replace our phones, right? Lenovo is entering into markets where people haven't been able to afford a phone before, but now they can. And so the growth in that market is much greater than it is just trying to get us to replace our iPhones and hoping that we reproduce and get our kids iPhones, right? Does that make sense? And their computers are similar. An Apple Mac is an expensive computer compared to the Windows equivalent. Lenovo also owns the IBM ThinkPad line, and so that's cheaper than Macs. Okay, now let's look at Yahoo and Google. In theory, Yahoo and Google are in the same business, yet Google's got a much higher PE ratio than Yahoo. Why do you think that is? Yeah, it's got to be the growth. And in fact, in this case, Yahoo is kind of shrinking. Let's talk about pharmaceuticals. In the pharmaceutical industry, it's kind of like the movie business. It's really all about your next blockbuster. And so what you want to do when you're trying to value a pharmaceutical company is look at what's called their pipeline. These are the new drugs that they have coming down the line. And it's really visible to people in the United States because the Food and Drug Administration, they have this whole process that these people go through, and it's public knowledge. So when you first come up with a drug and you want permission to start doing testing on it, you have to go to the FDA. And then after you do your first round of animal tests, then it gets reported. And if you didn't kill off all the mice, then you're on to perhaps the human trials, and that gets reported. And then if you didn't kill off the people and you didn't give them bad side effects like growing a third eye or a horn, stuff like that, then you can move on to potentially marketing that. And so you can kind of tell where these pharmaceutical companies have stuff in the pipeline. If a pharmaceutical company all has just stuff at the very end of the pipeline where it's about to go to market and nothing back here, we know the growth opportunities are smaller than a firm that has a pipeline full of ideas at different stages. And so if we looked at Pfizer and AstraZeneca, which one would you suppose had a better pipeline at the time this snapshot was taken? Yeah, it's got to be AstraZeneca. And then finally, Amazon and Alibaba. At the time that I did this slide, Amazon had 0 earnings. And if you put 0 on the bottom, it's undefined, right? And so that's why it's not applicable. Now look at Alibaba. Does anyone know what Alibaba is? It's like Chinese Amazon. Yeah, take a look at the growth there. Why was the growth so high for Alibaba compared to Amazon? Well, think about Amazon. So this is 2015. Think about Amazon's core market at that time. It's the U.S., right? The U.S., Western Europe. And they've been in both places for a long time. The growth isn't there. But Amazon, by the way, I've used Amazon in China before, but it's basically just peanuts. No one wants to actually do business with them. And so what you end up with is there was this huge crowd in China, a huge opportunity to do online marketing, and it wasn't being taken advantage of. Alibaba steps in and does that. And it's really cool if you can find a market like China where stuff hasn't been done before. All you have to do is copy what was done in the US, add local flavor to it, and you're successful. And the same thing's been done in India too. Okay, now let me tell you about the growth prospects for online in China. First time I went to China, 2011, I walk into the supermarket, and it's nothing but a sea of black hair. I mean, we're all packed tight, right? The stores are just crawling. And there were all of these little stalls where people were peddling their wares. Everything was just crowded. By the last time I went to China, I got out of there in January of 2019, the stores were relatively empty. This is before COVID. What do you think happened in the meantime between 2011 and 2019? Yeah, people started doing it online. In fact, in China, you can get damn near anything delivered to your apartment by a little guy on an electric motorcycle. Any time of the day. Why in the world would you go down to Walmart and fight with the people at the register? By the way, I've stood in a line in China that was at least 50 feet long trying to get to a cash register. Why would you want to do that when you could just have some dude drop it off at your apartment door? Does that make sense? And so the online marketing just exploded there. That's why that PE ratio of Alibaba is fairly high. Questions? Okay, let's jump into stock features. Oh, wow, got it right. Okay, now let's talk about some of the things. We've talked about what dividends are. You do need to know that they are not a liability of the firm unless they're declared by the board. In other words, you could have a firm that's paying $1 every year and has been forever and a day. Are they required to pay $1 this year? No. Every single one of those dividends has been declared independently by the board, and if the board figures out that they don't have the money to pay a dividend, then they don't pay it. Does that make sense? Now, if the board is stupid enough to declare a dividend and then not pay it, then it becomes a liability, and then the shareholders could actually force the firm to go bankrupt for non-payment of a dividend. But that's the only case. And you would have to have an extraordinarily stupid board to declare a dividend they could not pay. Payment of dividends is not considered a business expense. If you think back to interest, we have it subtracted out on our income statement before we calculate the taxes. That's not the case with dividends. Dividends are actually down there after the net income is already calculated. The taxes have already been paid. And so it's not tax deductible to pay dividends. There's this weird, oh, by the way, for people like you and me, dividends tend to be taxable. And I say tend to be, we had this really great law for a while where everybody paid a flat tax on dividends. And then they started saying, well, if you don't make this much money, then you don't have to pay taxes on it, and blah, blah, blah. Well, anyway, long story short, for the great majority of American history, and probably will be again, dividends are taxable to individuals. But if they're paid to corporations, we allow a 70% deduction. In other words, if the corporation receives 100 million in dividends, they're only going to have to pay taxes on 30 million of that. And you say, wait a minute, is that corporate fat cats getting their way with the government? And the answer is no. And here's the way to think about that. If a corporation is receiving dividends, it means they own the shares of another company. Does that make sense? So in order for me to be receiving dividends as a company, I have to own the shares of another company. Now that company goes out and they're doing business. When they make $1, they have to pay corporate income tax. And so now let's say there's 65 cents left over after they pay their corporate income tax. And they pay that 65 cents out to the corporation that owns the shares. If they're going to have to pay dividend taxes on that, then maybe another, let's say 15 cents falls off of that. Now we're down to 50 cents. And now they're going to turn around and have to pay that out to their shareholders as a dividend. And those shareholders are going to have to pay taxes too. And so by the time we get through here, we've got basically triple taxation. Remember when we talked about corporations, we talked about double taxation? Apparently, double taxation is just fine, but triple taxation is a bridge too far, and we as Americans just cannot put up with that. Now, I should say that they pay a tax, on minimum 30% or maximum 30% of the dividends that they receive. Because if I as a company own at least 80% of another company, then those dividends to me are tax-free because that's considered to be some sort of unconsolidated subsidiary. In other words, I really own that company. And so the dividends coming from that company are actually just intra-company cash transfers. They're not actually transfers from one entity to the other. And the government, just like they don't tax me when I move money from my checking account into my savings account, we're not going to tax these people when they move from a subsidiary to the mothership. We're not going to do that. And so really that 30% that they're paying taxes on is the maximum number. And when we look at acquisitions, when we get to chapter 21, we're going to see that's really important for when we go out to buy another company to go ahead and try to get 80% of the shares so we don't end up paying taxes on any dividends that we receive from that company that we bought. Now let's talk about shareholder rights. We have the right to vote on matters of great importance. Now, what are matters of great importance? Well, we know that we are going to elect the board of directors. Those are the people that we're hiring to basically force the managers to act in our interest. That's the idea. And also, we will see that for certain big decisions like selling the company, if we're going to sell the company, we're going to have a shareholder vote on that. And in fact, recently, Credit Suisse went out of business in Switzerland and was sold to UBS, which is the other big Swiss bank. The government actually suspended the requirement for the shareholder voting on that merger because it was such importance to the world financial system. Because if the merger didn't go through, then everything would have just fallen apart. So governments occasionally will lift the rules to try to make things happen. But for the most part, we have not seen that in the U.S. Now let's talk about proxy voting. If you give someone your proxy, it allows them to not only exercise their votes, but also yours. And proxy voting in the United States is something that we have and we take it for granted. For instance, I receive these emails and they say, go vote your proxy now. And I can actually online vote the way I want it to, and I give them the proxy basically to vote my shares the way I have said to at the shareholder meeting. But you'll have other countries where this isn't the case. For example, in France, they don't have proxy voting. If you want your votes to count, you have to show up at the annual meeting. And so if you're a dairy farmer in the south of France and Marseille, and you have 10 shares in Total, the French oil company, you're not going to have your voice heard because there's no way you're going to jump in the car and drive to Paris to vote your 10 shares and then jump back and come back in time to milk the cows in the evening. It's just not going to happen. And so what we see is that this proxy voting is important for letting minority or small shareholders have their voice in how the company gets ran. In Europe, it's ran basically, or in France for sure, it's ran basically for the interests of the biggest shareholders because they're the ones who have the incentive to show up at the meeting and vote their shares. Now, I will tell you about one other kind of annual meeting attendee. In Hong Kong, there are little old ladies that will buy one share. And they buy one share in lots of different companies. And you say, well, that's smart. That's diversifying your portfolio. But that's not their purpose. Their purpose is to go to the annual meeting and have the free buffet lunch. And so when they do their analysis on picking stocks, they're not looking at future growth rates or potential accounting frauds. What they're looking at is what's the date of the annual meeting so I could pick a company that doesn't have an annual meeting on the same day as another annual meeting that I'm attending. And so these little old ladies, basically, they try to hit as many of these annual meetings as they can, because over time, the meals that they get are worth more than what they paid for the share of stock. Isn't that pretty cool? Okay. Let's see. So you also have the right to share proportionally in all dividends paid to common. So, for instance, if I own 10% of the shares, that means that I get 10% of any dividends paid to common shares. So that's an ironclad feature for these. Another is to share proportionally in all assets remaining after liquidation. So you remember I've talked about the bankruptcy procedure before, and the people at the very back of the line are the common shareholders. If I own 20% of the shares and they've already liquidated the company, I'm able to now get 20% of what's left over after they paid everybody else. That's what we mean by share proportionally. It's in proportion to your ownership of the firm. Any questions so far? Cumulative versus straight voting. This one blows people's minds, but it's really not that hard. So here's the idea. In straight voting, everybody gets one vote per share. And then when the board of directors comes up for election, then we can have one vote for each one of those races, but we're only per share. But we're only allowed them to apply to that race. But cumulative voting says I can take all those votes and add them together, and then I can concentrate those votes on one person. So for instance, we've got our 3 people standing for election here, and I own 50% plus 1 of the shares. We've got straight voting. And we're going to start with Ms. Roll. I like her. You don't. You guys own the rest of the shares. I like her. You don't. Who wins? I do. Well, I do because you're my candidate, right? Okay. Now, I like Ms. Benny else. 50% plus 1. You guys don't. Who's going to win? I like Ms. Knight. You guys don't. Who's going to win? Yeah. And it turns out, if we had straight voting, then someone with simply 50% plus 1 of the shares gets to elect all 12 or however many directors are on the board. Does that sound fair? No. The person with 50% plus 1, you would think they should only get to elect 7 of the 12 directors, right? They should have an edge, but it shouldn't be 100%. So straight voting allows you folks to pool all your votes, and instead of these being 3 separate races, now we've got your ability for you to pile all your votes on one candidate. And so you guys could actually get some representation. So this is actually the only way minority shareholders get board representation is through cumulative voting. Let me say that again. The only way minority shareholders, meaning people who have less than 50%, are going to get any board representation is through cumulative voting. The only way minority shareholders get representation on the board is through cumulative voting, because if it's straight voting, it's just purely the 50% plus 1 person continually gets to choose all of the board. Now we're going to do a little math, and we're going to see how many votes it's going to take for you to be able to elect someone. And we have a formula here, 1 over n plus 1. N is the number of people standing for election. In our case, we had 3. So 1 over n plus 1. N plus 1 is 4. 1 over 4. We're going to multiply by the number of shares outstanding, and then we're going to add 1 share. And then we're going to add 1 share. So let's do an example here. The firm has 10,000 shares outstanding. 3 directors are up for election. How many shares must you own to guarantee that you can elect 1 director? Well, 1 over 4 multiplied by that 10,000 shares gives us 2,500. We add 1. Therefore, if you have 2,501 shares, you are guaranteed to be able to elect a director. Now, you could elect a director with less than that, but you would have to get other shareholders to go along with you. So you'd have to do some sort of coalition to make that work. This is the number it takes to guarantee. Now you say, wait a minute, electing one director to a board might not make much of a difference. You're probably picturing a board being like a democracy where we all just vote on stuff and it's always 11-1. If you've only got one guy, it doesn't matter. That's not the case. Let's talk about the kind of people who become directors. They're not experts in the industry. They are intelligent, well-meaning people. They are going to be the CEOs of other companies outside of the area. They're going to be like the head of the Red Cross is usually someone that has lots of board director seats. There's always going to be at least one lawyer on the board. But these people are not experts. Now, let's think about who they know. They know the CEO. They golf with the CEO. Their kids go to the same private school. And so when the CEO comes in and tells them, hey folks, earnings are down, but it's all because of the market that we're in. It's just really bad for firms in our industry right now. The board's going to basically buy that. They're going to believe it. That CEO basically is their only source of information on what's going on in the industry unless they're doing their jobs and actually reading the Wall Street Journal, but most don't. So how does having one director matter? Well, it matters who you choose. So, for example, we've got Boeing and Airbus are the two big airliner manufacturers. And let's say that Airbus is the board that we're looking at, and I'm trying to get one person on there, and I managed to do it. Who should I choose? Well, how about Alan Mulally, who was in charge of Boeing back during their good years before he became CEO of Ford Motor Company. He's retired now. He would be an excellent board member because he actually knows the industry. And then when the CEO of Airbus comes in and says, he's probably French, he's like, wah, the industry is really bad, so, it's not my problem. Oh, now he's Italian. Okay, so not my problem, right? And Alan Mulally says, bullshit. And apparently Europeans don't do that because it gets everyone's attention. And Alan Mulally says, how come Boeing's doing so fine? If the entire industry, by the way, the industry really only has you two dudes in it, right? How come Boeing's doing so great and you're doing so badly? Now, do you think the other 11 directors might say, these are thoughtful, well-meaning people. They might now start listening to what I have to say too. And so you can actually put someone on that board that's going to persuade the rest of the board to think like you do if you choose the right person. Does that make sense?